Hello, my name is Anthony Terskavage. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist in Ohio and a professor at John Carroll University where I conduct psychological assessment research on the MMPI-2-RF. And in this section of the training, I'll be heading up a discussion of guidelines for interpreting the MMPI-2-RF. In this section, we'll have three major aims. The first aim will be to describe the standard MMPI-2-RF Interpretive Guidelines. These are outlined in the small blue manual that you get with the MMPI-2-RF test materials. Next, we will review a tool that you can use to simplify your interpretation. This is the MMPI-2-RF Interpretation Worksheet. Next, we'll describe how to analyze the validity scales of a test protocol, which, as we'll talk about, is the first step in interpreting the scales for a good reason. And then finally, we will discuss some sample cases and illustrate the interpretation strategies by way of these samples. We'll begin first with our first unit on interpretive guidelines.
Interpretive guidelines for the MMPI-2-RF can be found in the Manual for Administration, Scoring, and Interpretation, and in my book, Interpreting the MMPI-2-RF. In developing these guidelines, we sought to provide very comprehensive guidance on how to write up an MMPI-2-RF interpretation. One of the challenges with the MMPI-2 was that the manual was not comprehensive, and users had to turn to secondary sources to interpret the test. As a result, two users or two interpreters looking at the same set of results and the same protocol could wind up with a very different interpretation in some cases, which is obviously not desirable. So we wanted to have comprehensive interpretive guidelines that anyone following these guidelines interpreting a specific set of results would essentially come up with the same interpretation as another user of the test. So they provide very detailed guidance on how to structure the interpretation, where to find the interpretive statements relevant to each of the scores on the instrument, and the feedback we've received is that they really do facilitate developing a comprehensive and standard MMPI-2-RF interpretation.
Once again, the interpretive guidelines are outlined in the thinner blue manual, the MMPI-2-RF Manual for Administration, Scoring, and Interpretation. And in this manual, you'll not only have those guidelines and interpretive recommendations for all of the scales of the MMPI-2-RF, but there's also a few case illustrations presented in the manual as well. The structure for MMPI-2-RF interpretation is actually relatively simple. As you see here, it's organized into two main areas, the first being protocol validity and the second main area being substantive scale interpretation. So starting first with the main interpretation area, protocol validity, these scale scores relate to how individuals approached the MMPI-2-RF testing, and we see the sub-areas of protocol validity are content non-responsiveness, over-reporting, and under-reporting. Content non-responsiveness reflects protocol validity issues unrelated to the content of the test, and these are going to be issues such as non-responding, random responding, and various forms of acquiescent or counter-acquiescent responding. Over-reporting is going to reflect exaggeration of psychological, somatic, or cognitive problems, and under-reporting reflects the minimization or denial of psychological issues. Turning next to the substantive scale interpretation, the second major area of MMPI-2-RF interpretation, we see here that the five broad domains of personality psychopathology are represented by letters A through E, including somatic cognitive dysfunction, emotional dysfunction, thought dysfunction, behavioral dysfunction, and interpersonal functioning. And then finally, interests, diagnostic considerations, and treatment considerations are also included in the structure of MMPI-2-RF interpretation. All scales in the MMPI-2-RF interpretive manual have specific tables that outline their interpretive recommendations. Now, the way these tables are structured is slightly different depending on whether or not we're looking at a validity scale or a substantive scale, On this slide, we have an example of an interpretive table for a validity scale, and on the next slide, we'll look at one for a substantive scale. But here we have the interpretive recommendations for variable response inconsistency. As you've learned earlier in an earlier module, this scale assesses the degree to which someone randomly responds to the MMPI-2-RF. And in the first column, we have various t-score cutoffs, ranging from relatively low t-scores of 30 to 38 to the top left where we have a high t-score cutoff of 80 or higher. And of course, because these are in t-score units, 50 is the general population mean. Next to the t-score cutoffs, we have the protocol validity concerns that are related to each of these. So, for example, at a t-score cutoff of 80 or higher, that score would indicate that the protocol is invalid because of excessive variable response inconsistency. In the next column, we have the possible reasons for the score, and as you'll see, there are several possible reasons. So the first here is that it could be due to reading or language limitations, or perhaps cognitive impairment, errors in recording responses, intentional random responding, or even an uncooperative test-taking approach. So any or all of these possible reasons, it could be the cause of this elevated score of 80 or higher on VRIN, and it's important to consider extra test data to rule in or rule out each of these possibilities. And then in the final column, to the right, we have the interpretive implications, and we see here, for example, that at a score of 80 or higher, if someone produces that score on VRIN, then the protocol is uninterpretable. Okay, so in other words, stop here, go no further, and as we'll discuss, this includes not interpreting the remaining over-reporting and under-reporting validity scales as well, because those are going to be impacted by variable response inconsistency. And on this slide, we have an example of what an interpretive table looks like for a substantive scale. So in this example, it's RC1, somatic complaints, which measures a variety of different somatic and cognitive problems. And these substantive scale interpretive tables are organized into four main areas. The first area are interpretive statements that are based on test responses. So these statements are derived from the actual content of the test items. And we see for RC1, there's three possible types of interpretations based off of test responses. One statement for if the t-score is low, less than 39. Another if it's elevated at a level of 65 to 79. And then a third possible interpretive statement if the individual's RC1 score is very elevated at a t-score of 80 or higher. Next, we have the interpretive statements that are based off of empirical correlates. So in these cases, there have been either research studies or data presented in the MMPI-2-RF technical manual, that's the large, thick green manual, that support that RC1 scores are associated with these characteristics. So, for example, there's been research that demonstrates that RC1 scores are associated with being preoccupied with health concerns, being prone to develop physical symptoms in response to stress, and other issues listed there. The third area of substantive scale interpretation is the diagnostic considerations section. And this section is based on the test authors' recommendations of how these constructs are related to various forms of psychopathology. And we see here that for RC1, if this is elevated at 65T or higher, then the diagnostic consideration would be to evaluate for somatoform disorder. And the key word here, or the key words rather, are to consider and to evaluate. By no means does an individual have the ability to make a diagnosis from a test score alone. These test scores only provide considerations for further evaluation. And then finally, the last section is treatment considerations, and these also are derived by the test authors' understanding of the constructs and how they're likely to be associated with treatment. And here we see the treatment consideration for individuals who have a clinical elevation of 65T or higher is that these individuals are likely to reject psychological interpretations of their somatic complaints. If you're interested in learning more about the theoretical and empirical bases for these interpretations, one resource is Interpreting the MMPI-2-RF by Yosef Ben Porith. Now we've come to our first learning check. So where are the guidelines for interpreting scores on the MMPI-2-RF presented? Are they presented in the MMPI-2-RF user guides for reports, the MMPI-2-RF manual for administration, scoring, and interpretation? That's that relatively thin blue book. The MMPI-2-RF technical manual, which is the thicker green book, or all of the above? The answer is B, the MMPI-2-RF manual for administration, scoring, and interpretation. We're now moving into the second section of our module where we'll discuss a good tool for creating a more efficient interpretation process. This is the MMPI-2-RF Interpretation Worksheet.
The MMPI-2-RF Interpretation Worksheet is designed to facilitate a standard interpretation of the MMPI-2-RF. It provides an organizational structure for the interpretation. It guides the user as to which sources of information, which scales are relevant to each of the domains of the instrument, and the process that we recommend following when developing an MMPI-2-RF interpretation is greatly facilitated by use of this of the worksheet. The worksheet, of course, is of particular relevance when using the score report because the score report does not include an interpretation of the results. And in fact, if you follow our interpretive guidelines at the end of the process, the worksheet should include much of the same information that you would find in an interpretive report, minus the annotation and the references that the report provides. In particular, people who are just learning the MMPI-2-RF have found the worksheet a very useful aid in developing their competence in interpreting the MMPI-2-RF.
So we will begin by looking at the MMPI-2-RF Interpretive Worksheet. This is a 4-page document. We'll look at this on 4 consecutive slides. Here on the first page of the interpretation worksheet, we have the protocol validity scales, which are, of course, interpreted first. And these are broken out into the 3 major protocol validity concerns of content non-responsiveness, over-reporting, and under-reporting. And for each of these areas, we have the scales that assess these protocol validity issues. And the little lines next to them is where you write in the T-scores for these scales for an individual's profile. And then underneath each of the areas, we have some lines there where you would write in your interpretation of these scales. And what this does is it organizes the interpretations in a manner consistent with the standard MMPI-2-RF interpretive structure, which, for example, says that you begin with assessing content non-responsiveness, and then over-reporting, and then under-reporting. So essentially, this puts everything in the correct order for you. And here we have the substantive scale interpretation for the interpretation worksheet. And we begin substantive scale interpretation on page 2 of this worksheet. Again, it has 4 pages. And here we see somatic cognitive dysfunction and emotional dysfunction. So remember, the MMPI-2-RF has 5 major substantive domains: somatic cognitive dysfunction, emotional dysfunction, behavioral dysfunction, thought dysfunction, and interpersonal function. And each of these domains are interpreted separately, and so they're listed in separate sections in the substantive scale interpretation worksheet. Now, the MMPI-2-RF is also organized hierarchically in terms of its substantive scale structure. You've learned earlier that the higher order scales are the broadest level of measurement. The RC scales are a more mid-level of measurement, and the specific problem scales are narrower measures of substantive constructs. And we see this play out in the interpretation of the emotional dysfunction domain. So the first scale listed there is the higher order scale, emotional internalizing dysfunction. And this is because this is going to be the first scale that you interpret if, of course, it's clinically indicated by an elevated score. And then next you see the RC scales listed: RCD, demoralization; RC2, low positive emotions; and RC7, dysfunctional negative emotions. These would be the next scales that you would interpret. And again, we'll go into this process in more detail later. And then after interpreting the RC scales, then you would turn to interpretation of the more narrow level constructs associated with the RC scale. So for example, in the case of RCD, there are the internalizing specific problem scales of suicidal death ideation, helplessness, self-doubt, and efficacy that are more narrow measures of this demoralization construct. If we look at the somatic cognitive dysfunction interpretation, there is no hierarchical structure to this domain, in the sense that there's no higher order scale for this domain like we have with emotional dysfunction. However, RC1, typically you would interpret that scale first if it is clinically elevated, and then follow with interpretations of the somatic cognitive specific problem scales, more narrow measures of somatic cognitive issues. On page 3 of the interpretation worksheet, which we see here, we have the 3 remaining substantive domains of the MMPI-2-RF: thought dysfunction, behavioral dysfunction, and interpersonal functioning. And both thought dysfunction and behavioral dysfunction have this hierarchical structure by which we interpret the scales, as we've discussed earlier in the context of emotional internalizing dysfunction. And we also have here the interpersonal functioning domain. These scales have no hierarchical structure, so you're going to interpret them in the order of the most extreme elevations being interpreted first. And then finally we have the 2 interest scales. And then on the final page of the interpretation worksheet, page 4, we finish up by interpreting diagnostic considerations and treatment considerations for all of the MMPI-2-RF substantive scales that were elevated. These are all going to be summarized in this section of the interpretation worksheet. So again, this worksheet is very helpful because it forces you to put all of the test interpretations in the order that is indicated by the standard interpretive guidelines. So now that we've had a chance to become oriented to the MMPI-2-RF interpretation worksheet, let's look at an example of how this works in practice. So what we have here is a profile, and we see the MMPI-2-RF validity scales. And the first thing that we'll want to look at is the cannot say score, VRIN, and TRIN, and these are the first 3 items that are listed on the MMPI-2-RF interpretive worksheet underneath the header of content non-responsiveness. And we see here that this individual has a cannot say score of 17. You can see that in the bottom left there. And his VRIN and TRIN T-scores are 48 and 57 T. Also, interesting finding on this page is if we look at the response percentages for these scales, a couple values are bolded. So we see underneath FBS that this individual responded to only 87% of the FBS items, and underneath K, the individual responded to only 86% of the items. And whenever this value is underneath 90, it's going to be bolded in the interpretive report. So what we're going to look at next is how to transfer this information to the MMPI-2-RF interpretation worksheet. So here we see the scores applied to the beginning of the MMPI-2-RF interpretation worksheet. So the cannot say, VRIN, and TRIN scores have been transferred over. And as in practice, what you would be doing then is referring to the interpretation tables for each of these scores for your interpretive statements, where applicable. In this case, we only have interpretive statements for cannot say because VRIN and TRIN are both within normal limits. And what we can see here is that the interpretation of this elevated CNS score is that non-responding limits the interpretability of scores on, and then we're going to list scales with less than a 90% response rate. We saw in the validity scales that this included FBS and K. Also, although we didn't see it, the response rates are below 90% for RC3 as well as aesthetic literary interests. RC3 had a particularly low response rate of less than 50%, so we're going to add the additional interpretation that only RC3 is impacted appreciably by non-responding. Thus, cynical beliefs, which are measured by RC3, cannot be assessed as a result of non-responding. And we note that there are no indications of inconsistent responding as indicated by VRIN or TRIN. So there's a few different situations where this worksheet is particularly helpful, namely when individuals are first learning to interpret the MMPI-2-RF or when they don't routinely use it. This is a good reminder of how to structure one's interpretations. It's also helpful for individuals who are in high-risk settings, like forensic settings, for example, when you want to be sure that you don't miss any interpretive information. Now, one option is to, instead of ordering a basic score report, is to order the MMPI-2-RF interpretive report. And what this does is it automatically structures all of the interpretive information into the framework that you see into the worksheet. So this can be a very efficient way of interpreting the MMPI-2-RF, although it does come at an increased cost relative to the basic score report. So now we have our Unit 2 review question. The recommended structure for the MMPI-2-RF Substantive Scale interpretation is based largely on A, the validity scales, B, the higher order scales, C, the RC scales, or D, the interest scales. The correct answer is B, the higher order scales. As we discussed earlier, the MMPI-2-RF is organized hierarchically in terms of the substantive scale structure, and by extension, the interpretation of the substantive scales is organized hierarchically, where the first and most prominent scale interpreted are the higher order scales, those scales at the top of the hierarchy. In Unit 3, we'll be discussing interpretation of the validity scales.
Interpretation of scores on the MMPI-2-RF begins always with a close consideration, a careful consideration of scores on the validity scales of the instrument. These scales are designed to give us an indication of whether and to what extent a test taker was able and chose to follow the administration instructions, whether they were able to read and understand and respond relevantly to the test items, and whether there was any effort to over or underreport in their responding. We always need to look at these scales first because they tell us how much confidence we can place in scores on the substantive scales. So a careful consideration of this MMPI-2-RF indicators of protocol validity is always the first step when interpreting the MMPI-2-RF.
Before moving into the MMPI-2-RF validity scales, we have to make an important distinction. The distinction between instrument validity versus protocol validity. So starting first with instrument validity, this refers to the psychometrics of scale scores from a psychological test. In instrument validity, we have concepts such as concurrent validity and predictive validity and discriminative validity, all of these referring to the extent to which psychological test scores are associated with other indicators in expected ways. And this type of validity, instrument validity, influences one's decisions about which tests to use. On the other hand, protocol validity is what we're concerned with when it comes to interpreting the MMPI-2-RF validity scale. So protocol validity is the validity of a protocol, a test that an individual takes. And in some cases, a test may be invalid. Test administration, that is, may be invalid regardless of whether or not the scores from the scale themselves are valid or not. And as we'll discuss next, there's several different threats to protocol validity that exist. So there are several threats to protocol validity that relate to different forms of invalid responding. The first broad category of invalid responding is non-content based invalid responding. Some examples of this include non-responding, which is providing unscorable responses to test questions, random responding, which is providing random true-false responses to MMPI-2-RF test questions, And then we have fixed responding. Fixed responding can occur in two different ways. One is an acquiescent fixed response style, where an individual indiscriminately provides true responses to test questions regardless of their content. And then there's also a counter-acquiescent fixed responding set, and in that case someone responds false to questions irregardless of their content. We also have a major category of invalid responding called content-based invalid responding. So these are invalid responding styles that where the test taker does consider the content of the test items when responding in an invalid manner. So we have, for example, over-reporting, which is the exaggeration of psychological or other problems. And on the one hand, this could be intentional over-reporting, and this would be situations where we have exaggeration or fabrication of psychological problems. Most of the time, this is going to occur in response to some external incentive to exaggerate psychological issues, such as, for example, attempting to obtain disability payments or attempting to achieve a not guilty by reason of insanity verdict in a trial. And then also we have unintentional over-reporting. We refer to this in the MMPI nomenclature as a cry for help. So there are situations where somebody is in treatment, for example, and they want to make sure that the clinician knows that they have problems that they want help with because they're distressed, and so they may over-report their problems to some extent as a cry for help, as an unintentional cry for help. Also, in the area of content-based invalid responding, we have underreporting. So this is going to be the minimization of psychological problems. And here too, this can be intentional, in which case somebody outright minimizes or denies their psychological issues. Underreporting, for example, is very common in pre-hire psychological evaluations, for example, for public safety positions. Also fairly common in child custody cases. In these situations, somebody is intentionally minimizing or denying psychological problems because it is in their best interest to do so. But underreporting also can be unintentional in the sense that someone may have severe psychological problems, but they don't want to admit to them either because of stigma or because of a coping response of denial. So it is possible for underreporting to occur unintentionally as well. So here we have the MMPI-2-RF validity scales and their descriptions. The first two scales listed, VRIN and TRIN, are intended to assess non-content-based invalid responding styles, both random responding and fixed true or fixed false responding. The next two scales, F and FP, are intended to assess over-reporting of psychological problems. The next three scales, FS, FBS, and RBS, are also designed to detect over-reporting, but in this case, they're detecting over-reporting of somatic and cognitive issues. And then finally, we have the two under-reporting scales, LR and KR, rounding out the MMPI-2-RF validity scales. So here we have one of the more important interpretive tables for you to reference as you're going through the MMPI-2-RF scales. This is threats to protocol validity and confounds. It's presented in Interpreting the MMPI-2-RF by Ben Quarif, 2012. To orient you to this table, we have the MMPI-2-RF scales listed in the top two rows. These are all of the validity scales. And then in the first column, we have threats to protocol validity as well as extra test confounds. And we'll just start with the second row of this table where we see non-responding. Underneath CNS in this row, we see an X. What that means is that this scale, CNS, cannot say is designed to assess non-responding. We see that the remaining scales in this row have negative signs. And what this means is that non-responding artifactually lower scores on these validity scales. And this makes intuitive sense, right? Consider as a thought experiment if somebody didn't respond to any of the MMPI-2-RF scales, well, necessarily all their scores on the validity scales are going to be 0, right? So it's going to artificially lower those scores. So that's what those minus signs indicate. Now the gray boxes indicate that if there's a high enough non-response rate to any of the validity scales, it invalidates the scores on those validity scales. And we set this cutoff of the non-response rate at 10% or more. In other words, if the response rate is less than 90% on any of these validity scales, then we don't interpret them. So for example, if someone responded to only 75% of the VRIN items, we wouldn't be able to interpret VRIN. That's what this gray box indicates. In the next row of the table, we have random responding, and we see here an X underneath VRIN, because VRIN, variable response inconsistency, is designed to assess random responding. We also see some positive signs for the validity scales F, FP, FS, FBS, RBS, L, and K. This means that when random responding occurs, it's going to artifactually increase scores on these scales. And we also see that these scales are highlighted in gray. And what this means is if we have an elevated VRIN score, indicating excessive random responding, then this invalidates FR, FPR, FS, FBS, RBS, L, and K. Looking at the next row, fixed true and fixed false responding, we see that TRIN assesses both of these threats. And here too, if an individual has an elevated score on TRIN, it's going to increase most of the validity scale scores and also invalidate scores on those validity scales F, FP, FS, FBS, RBS, L, and K. In the next section of the table, we have the content-based threats to protocol validity, over-reporting, and under-reporting, and we see X's there to indicate that F, FP, FS, FBS, and RBS are intended to assess over-reporting, and L and K are intended to assess under-reporting. And then finally, we have another very important aspect of this table, which are the extra test confounds. So looking at psychopathology, in situations where someone has significant mental health problems, it's going to potentially artificially inflate scores on all of the over-reporting scales. If somebody has legitimate medical conditions, it could potentially inflate scores on FBS and FBS, FS and FBS. And if somebody has a traditional upbringing, it can inflate their scores on LR, uncommon virtues. If they have good adjustment, it could inflate their scores on KR, which is adjustment validity. So what this means is that when elevations on the validity scales occur, you have to consider these extra test confounds, because as we've discussed earlier, there's several possible reasons for elevations on these scales other than over-reporting or under-reporting. So if you see someone with an elevation on F, for example, you have to ask yourself, does this individual have significant psychopathology that could potentially account for this elevation or not, right? If somebody has an elevation on FS, you have to ask yourself the question and ask your client the question, does this person have legitimate medical conditions that could artificially inflate their score on FS? Or do they not? If they don't, then the most likely explanation is they're over-reporting somatic problems. But these are the considerations that you have to make when you're interpreting the protocol validity scales. And we'll get a lot of practice with this coming up in the next few slides. So to review, we have three major categories of threats to protocol validity. The first category of threat is content non-responsiveness, and this is assessed by cannot say, which is the number of unscorable responses, as well as VRIN or TRIN. Now, if VRIN or TRIN is greater than or equal to 80, a t-score of 80, then that invalidates the entire protocol. Stop here, go no further. And it not only invalidates the substantive scales, but it also invalidates the other over-reporting and under-reporting validity scales, as we saw on the last slide. The next major area of validity scale interpretation are the over-reporting scales. In these scales, we invalidate a profile only if F is equal to 120, or FP is greater than or equal to 100. For FS, FBS, and RBS, again, those are the measures of overreporting of somatic cognitive problems. So when they're elevated at extreme levels, they only potentially invalidate the somatic cognitive scales, substantive scales. And then we have the underreporting scales, L and K, and importantly, you do not ever invalidate a profile based off of the underreporting scales. It's not possible. You can still interpret the test, although when these scales are elevated, the primary implication is that the scores on the substantive scales may underestimate someone's actual psychological problems. And as a review, the interpretive tables for the validity scales are in the blue interpretation manual. If you have the interpretation manual, now would be a good time to get it out to refer to. And as a reminder, the way these tables are structured for the validity scales is we have the T-score cutoffs, protocol validity concerns, possible reasons for the score, and oftentimes there's several possible reasons that we need to consider, and then the interpretive implications. In this case, we see that if TRIN is at 80T or higher, then the protocol is uninterpretable. Again, we just saw that in the last slide. Here's another example of a validity scale interpretive table. This is for L, uncommon virtues. And again, you see here for possible reasons for score, like for example, at a T-score of 70 to 79, this can be due to inconsistent responding, traditional upbringing, or underreporting. This is all information that we saw in that confounds table. And the implications of scores in the 70 to 79 range, for example, is that scores on the substantive scales should be interpreted with caution, and that the scores may underestimate a person's actual psychological problems. So let's look at an example. Here we have the profile for the MMPI-2-RF validity scales for a test taker. Just to briefly orient you to the profile, we have here all the validity scales, VRIN through K, and we have their T-scores plotted on the graph above. And below the graph we have the raw scores, the T-scores associated with those raw scores, the response percentages. So these are going to be the percentage of items that were responded to for each of the scales. And then the bottom left we have cannot say, the number of items left blank, and then we also have in the bottom right the percent true, percent items answered true across the entire test. And what you'll notice is we start by interpreting cannot say in the standard MMPI-2-RF interpretive framework. It is 34, which is quite high. So this individual had unscorable responses to 34 of the 338 test questions. And what we'll need to do next is examine the response percentages for the scales to see if they were impacted by non-responding. And in the interpretive manual, any scales that have less than 90% response percentage should be interpreted with caution due to non-responding. And we see that this is the case for several of the validity scales, including VRIN, TRIN, F, FP, FBS, L, and K. All of these are less than 90% response rate. And the question is then, are we able to interpret any other validity scale other than cannot say at this point? And if so, which ones? The answer is that we can't interpret any other validity scale other than cannot say, because we cannot interpret VRIN or TRIN because their response percentages are less than 90%. And this is going to artificially deflate scores on these scales and invalidate them. It's also going to invalidate the remaining scales from the MMPI-2-RF because we're not able to determine if somebody appropriately responded to the content of the test. And that's because we can't interpret VRIN or TRIN, which are designed to do that. Let's consider another example. So in this example, we'll start again by interpreting cannot say. And we see here that the value is 8, indicating that the person produced unscorable responses to 8 questions. So what we'll want to do next is examine the response percentages for the scales to see if any of them were impacted by non-responding. And again, the cutoff here is less than 90%. So if somebody responds to less than 90% of the questions on a scale, then that's going to impact the scores by artificially decreasing them. And we see that there are no issues with non-responding to any of the validity scales. All of the response percentages are greater than 90%. So now we can turn to interpreting the scores on these scales as indicating invalid responding. And just a quick look at the profile, we can tell that there's very prominent scores on VRIN as well as FP with high scores on F and FS and L as well. So the question is, how do we interpret this profile? Well, we begin by interpreting VRIN, and here the score, the t-score is 92. This is above our cutoff of 80, so we invalidate the rest of the profile. That includes the validity scales, the other validity scales. So we do not interpret, for example, the very high score on FP as indicating overreporting, and that's because FP scores are artificially inflated by random responding as assessed by VRIN, and we have very clear evidence of that here. So the only interpretation that we're making from these validity scales is that there is evidence of random responding. Now this could be due to intentional reasons such as uncooperativeness. It also could be unintentional because of reading or cognitive problems. We don't know. We'd have to follow up on that to make a determination. But again, the implication for MMPI-2-RF interpretation is once we have that elevation of 80 or higher on VRIN or TRIN, we stop there, we go no further, and that includes going no further with the validity scales. Here's another example. In this case, we have elevated scores on TRIN and L. We do see a cannot say score of 0 there, so this individual responded to all 338 of the questions. And now in this case, the TRIN score is higher than our cutoff of 80. So again, that completely invalidates the protocol. If either VRIN or TRIN are greater than 80, it completely invalidates the protocol, including the other validity scales. So we stop here at TRIN, we go no further. That means that we do not interpret the elevated score on LR. And again, the reason for this is because scores on LR are artificially inflated by responding in this manner on, as evidenced by the TRIN scale. In this example, we also have a cannot say score of 0, and we see elevations on TRIN as well as F. So here too, that TRIN score is above our cutoff of 80T. So that invalidates the entire protocol. We stop here, we go no further. We do not interpret the F scale. And the reason for this is the F scale, its scores are artificially inflated by individuals responding true indiscriminately to test items. In this example, we have prominent elevations on both VRIN as well as TRIN. In this case, we interpret both of those elevations as indicating random responding and fixed true responding, respectively, but we stop there. So even though we have very prominent elevations on several of the over-reporting validity scales, we do not interpret them. They are invalidated by the non-content based invalid responding. In this example, we will again start by interpreting cannot say. We see that it's 0, so we're good there. Next, we will interpret the non-content based invalidity indicators, VRIN and TRIN. Both of those are within normal limits, so we're good there. We're able to proceed to the over-reporting validity scales. And we see a prominent elevation on FR, which has a T-score of 120. So T-scores at this level on FR invalidate the substantive scales of the MMPI-2-RF. So what that means is we're able to interpret the rest of the overreporting validity scales. Certainly someone may overreport in various different manners, and it is acceptable and relevant to examine the other overreporting scales. And also we are able to interpret the underreporting scales as well. In this case, the underreporting scales are not elevated, but it would be possible for an individual to both overreport as well as underreport psychological problems. However, after the validity scales, we would not interpret the substantive scales of the test because of the elevation on FR of 120, which invalidates the protocol. Let's look at another example. So here we have a cannot say score of 0 and a Vrin and Trin score, which are within normal limits. Next, we have an F score of 106. So this score is at a level that raises concern about overreporting. It's not to the level where we necessarily invalidate the protocol. We'd have to be at a T-score of 120 to do that, but it does raise concern. So when we have scores at these levels on the validity scales, we need to consider the confounds that we've talked about earlier. So again, the confound for F is genuine psychopathology. So we'll want to consider for this individual if they have a history of genuine psychopathology, if they have a history of, for example, psychiatric inpatient hospitalizations, severe mental illness. And if they do, then a FR score at this level is fairly consistent with that confound. On the other hand, if they don't have a history of mental health treatment or severe psychological problems, then it's much more likely that this FR score indicates to some extent overreporting, which the scale is intended to assess. In this example, we have a cannot say score of 9, so we're going to review the response percentages for the validity scales. We see that only K is below our threshold of 90%, so to some extent K scores are going to be artificially deflated, although this individual has a very low score on K to begin with. But next we'll look at the Vrin and Trin scales. They're both within normal limits, and so we'll investigate now the 5 overreporting scales. I want to highlight here the FP scale. It's at a score of 111. Now the highest cutoff for FP is 100, and this is one of those cutoffs that invalidates the substantive scales of the test. So in this example, we would not interpret the substantive scales because the score is greater than 100 on FP. Again, we could still interpret, and we would do well to interpret the remaining validity scales, which evidence overreporting of somatic cognitive problems. We see that with the FS scale. And then there's also evidence of underreporting on the L scale as well. That is interpretable, and again, it is possible for someone to both overreport as well as underreport. Here's another example. In this case, the primary concerns relate to high scores on FR and FS. So in terms of FR, we have a score here that does to some extent indicate possible exaggeration of psychological problems, although we would definitely want to consider with a FR score in this range whether or not this score is due to genuine psychopathology, which, as we've discussed, is a confound of FR scores. Turning to FS, we have a score that's above the highest interpretive cutoff for FS. The highest cutoff is 100 for this scale. And so when we get scores at this level, we can be much more confident in ruling out the confounds. And in this case, the confound for FS is genuine medical problems. In other words, even people who have genuine physical health problems rarely score this high So the most likely explanation is exaggeration of somatic complaints. And the interpretive implication here is that scores on the somatic and cognitive substantive scales of the MMPI-2-RF may be invalid. In this example, we have several indications of overreporting in a variety of different domains. So not only is there evidence that the individual is potentially overreporting psychopathology, as indicated by F and FP, but also there's very strong evidence that they are overreporting somatic complaints, as we see with an FS score of 120, and also FBS and RBS are also elevated. Technically speaking, it would be possible to interpret the substantive scales from the MMPI-2-RF, although the interpretation of those scales would have to be qualified significantly to reflect the concerns with overreporting in general, as well as overreporting of somatic and cognitive problems. In this example, we see high score elevations on F, FS, and RBS. So there's indications of general overreporting, somatic overreporting, and also the elevation on RBS indicates that there is a strong likelihood of overreporting of memory complaints. So in this sort of situation, depending on the context of the evaluation, it may make sense to administer symptom validity tests or cognitive validity tests that could clarify the nature and the extent of the possible non-credible cognitive complaints that are being reported. In this example, underreporting is indicated by an elevated L score, which indicates that the test taker denied minor faults and shortcomings that most people are willing to acknowledge. Now, most of the time we want to consider the confound of LR, which is a traditional upbringing, but with scores this high on LR, we can mostly rule out these confounds and conclude that the most likely explanation is underreporting in this case. Now, this does not invalidate the MMPI-2-RF protocol. It only means that the substantive scales have to be interpreted with some caution, with the understanding that the substantive scale scores may underestimate a person's actual psychological problems. That being said, it's not uncommon in these situations of underreporting where there are elevations on the substantive scales, and again, they are interpretable, but they may, to some extent, be underestimates of a person's actual problems. In this example, the other underreporting scale, KR, adjustment validity, is elevated, which would indicate that any psychological problems reported on the substantive scales are likely to be underestimates of the actual problems the individual has. But again, the substantive scales are interpretable, elevations are interpretable, although again, we have to note that they may be underestimates. So this is the last of the profiles that we will be reviewing for the validity scales, and it's an interesting one. So a few things to note. First of all, we see extremely high elevations on L and K. Both of those scores are very close to or at the ceiling for the scales. And the other thing that's interesting in this profile is the VRID score. So the VRID score here is 34, which means that this individual was very careful and deliberate in the way that they responded to the test questions. So taking that into account, along with the very, very high scores on LR and KR, the most likely implication of these scores is that the individual was purposefully and deliberately underreporting. So this is the sorts of scores you may see if you administer the MMPI-2-RF in pre-hire contexts, such as with police officers, also to some extent in child custody evaluations, where there are external incentives to minimize psychological problems. Although it's very unlikely that the substantive scales are going to have any elevations, those would be interpretable, again, with the caveat that they're likely to severely underestimate the individual's actual problems. So let's do our first of two learning activities where you get a chance to review some profiles. In this example, we have several possible elevations. What are the key threats to protocol validity? In other words, how would you interpret this set of validity scales? So we'll begin the interpretation by looking at cannot say. That score is 0, so we're good to proceed. Next, we'll look at Vrin and Trin, and we see that both of these scales are elevated above the highest cutoff of ADT. So that indicates that there's excessive random responding as well as fixed true responding in this profile. Now, whenever Vrin or Trin is elevated, we stop there, we go no further. So what that means is even though we have prominently high scores on the over-reporting validity scales, we're not going to interpret them. We're stopping once we get to either Vrin or Trin having an elevation of AT or higher. Now in this example, what are the key threats to protocol validity that are evidenced? So cannot say here is 0, so we're good there. Vrin and Trin are both within normal limits, so we're able to proceed to the over-reporting validity scales. All of those are within normal limits. We do see that with the under-reporting scales, we have a t-score of 72 on K. And this is actually above the highest interpretive cutoff for KR. And the possible reasons for this score, as outlined in the interpretation tables, is going to be inconsistent responding or under-reporting. We can rule out inconsistent responding because Vrin is within normal limits. And so the most likely explanation for this K-score is under-reporting of psychological problems, and therefore we will interpret the substantive scales, but we'll do it with the caveat that the substantive scale scores may underestimate a person's problems. Now for some review questions for this unit. Which of the following t-scores would indicate that an MMPI-2-RF protocol is invalid? A, L greater than or equal to 80, B, Vrin greater than or equal to 80, C, F equal to 100, or D, FPR greater than or equal to 90. The answer here is B. This is the only cutoff presented here that validates a profile. So first of all, with LR, that's an under-reporting scale, and we will never invalidate a profile due to under-reporting. And for C, the interpretive cutoff for F to invalidate a profile is 120, not 100. And then for D, the interpretive cutoff for FP to invalidate a profile is 100, not 90. Here's the second question. If responses to less than 90% of the items on a scale are scoreable, low scores on that scale, A, can nevertheless be interpreted, B, need to be interpreted with caution, C, are uninterpretable, or D, indicate the absence of problems associated with high scores on that scale. The correct answer is C. In order to be able to answer this question, you would have to think back to the threats to the protocol validity and confounds table that we reviewed earlier. As we talked about, non-scoreable responses artificially lower scores on all of the scales on the MMPI-2-RF. So for that reason, when we have a response rate of 90% or lower, we're not able to interpret low scores on the MMPI-2-RF scales. Those are uninterpretable. If, however, there was an elevation, we still could interpret that high score, although it may to some extent underestimate the individual's problems. So now we move into our final unit of this module, which focuses on interpretation of the substantive scales of the MMPI-2-RF.
There are 42 substantive scales on the MMPI-2-RF. At first blush, that may appear to be a lot of information to try to integrate in a meaningful manner. The worksheet is really designed to help facilitate that process, and though it may appear complicated when first looking at this set of scores and wondering how to integrate it, if you follow the process that we recommend and describe for interpreting scores on the substantive scales, it's really straightforward, and you'll find that it does provide a standard and consistent interpretation of these results.
So now we'll dive into how to interpret the MMPI-2-RF substantive scales. Now, the most important thing is to recall that the substantive scales of the test are structured in a hierarchical manner where we have the three broad measures of major areas of psychopathology in the higher order scales. We have the restructured clinical scales, which are a mid-level of measurement, and then the hierarchy is rounded out by the specific problem scales, which are shorter measures of more narrow constructs. So the interpretation of the MMPI-2-RF substantive scales follows this hierarchical structure, wherein we begin with interpreting the higher order scales. Now, if only one higher order scale is elevated, we're going to use that as our starting point. After interpreting the higher order scale, we interpret in order the RC scales, the specific problem scales, and the Psi-5 scales in that domain of psychopathology. And we'll look at an example of this in a moment with the behavioral externalizing domain of psychopathology on the MMPI-2-RF. When interpreting the RC scales, if there are multiple RC scales within a domain that are elevated, then you proceed in order of elevation. In other words, you interpret the RC scale with the highest elevation first, followed by the RC scale with the second highest elevation, and so on. And after interpreting the RC scales, you incorporate the specific problem scales and Psi-5 scales that serve as facets of that RC scale. This sounds like a lot of information, and it sounds very complicated, but when we see an example in a moment, this will all make some more sense. Now, what if more than one higher order scale is elevated? In that case, you begin with the highest elevated higher order scale and proceed to the next highest elevated higher order scale after interpreting scales from the given domain. If there's no higher order scale elevated, then you move to the next level of measurement on the MMPI-2-RF substantive scales, which is the RC scales. Interpret the RC scales domain by domain in order of elevation, incorporating relevant specific problems scales and Psi-5 scales. Again, I think this will all make a lot more sense when we see a practical example. One thing to note before we move into the examples, however, is that the somatic cognitive dysfunction domain of the MMPI-2-RF is unique in that it does have a hierarchical structure, but it doesn't have a higher order scale. So with the somatic cognitive dysfunction domain scales, RC1, somatic complaints, essentially functions like a higher order scale for the somatic cognitive specific problem scales. And then to round out interpretation of the substantive scales, after you've gone through all of the domains where either a higher order scale or a RC scale was elevated, then what you're going to want to do is interpret any remaining elevated specific problem scales and also interpret the interpersonal and interest scales. And you may recall that these scales do not have a hierarchical structure like the other four domains of the MMPI-2-RF. And then, if relevant, add in diagnostic and treatment considerations indicated by the elevated MMPI-2-RF scores. And next we're going to move into a practical example illustrating how this is accomplished. Here we have an example of a profile's higher order and restructured clinical scale scores from a test taker. Now, where are we going to start in our interpretation of the MMPI-2-RF scales for this individual? So we're going to begin with BXD, Behavioral Externalizing Dysfunction, because that is the only higher order scale that is elevated, and we always begin by interpreting the higher order scales. And just as a reminder, the scales in the behavioral dysfunction domain are organized in this manner, where we have the higher order scale, Behavioral Externalizing Dysfunction, the restructured clinical scale for antisocial behavior, and its lower level specific problem scales, juvenile conduct problems and substance abuse. And then we have the RC scale 9, hypomanic activation, and its lower level specific problem scales, aggression and activation. And then finally we have the 2 personality psychopathology 5 scales in this behavioral dysfunction domain, aggressiveness and disconstraint. And looking at the standard interpretive framework, we're going to, of course, begin with the higher order scales, and then next we're going to interpret the restructured clinical scales in that domain. So here we have BXD from the Behavioral Externalizing Dysfunction domain as our only elevated higher order scale. So now we move to interpreting RC4 and RC9. And we see that RC4 is not elevated, it's below our cutoff of 65, but RC9 is elevated at a t-score of 80. So now we have our final review question for Unit 3. If the underreporting scales indicate a strong likelihood of underreporting, non-elevated scores on the substantive scales, A, can be interpreted as usual, B, can be interpreted with greater confidence, C, do not indicate the absence of problems, D, indicate the absence of problems. The answer to this question is C. If there's an indication of underreporting, then non-elevated scores do not indicate the absence of problems. And again, this is because when an individual underreports, it's going to lead to underestimates of their problems on the substantive scales. Thus, if somebody actually has a problem, then they may have a non-elevated scale as a result of underreporting. On this page, we see for the same profile the externalizing, interpersonal, and interest-specific problem scales. And it's on this page that we're going to continue our interpretation of the scales in the behavioral externalizing dysfunction domain. And we see that 2 more narrow measures related to RC9, aggression and activation, are both elevated. So we're going to interpret these scales next. So to review, the higher order scale, behavioral externalizing dysfunction, was elevated. And we always begin by interpreting the highest elevated higher order scale. So that's where the interpretation started. Next, because the BXD scale was in the behavioral dysfunction domain, we moved on to interpreting the RC scales, RC4 and RC9. Now recall in the last slide that RC4 was not elevated, but RC9 was, so that would be the next scale that we interpret after the higher order scale BXD. Now, after interpreting RC9, this is when we begin to interpret the more narrow the more narrow specific problem scales that are associated with RC9, and we can see that that's aggression and activation, and also both of these are elevated in this example, so we would next interpret aggression and activation. And now we've reached the last page of this individual's MMPI-2-RF profile, where we have the Psi-5 scales. And again, we're continuing with our interpretation of the substantive scales in the behavioral dysfunction domain of the test. If you look at point 4, the next step here is to evaluate aggressiveness and disconstraint. And if looking at the profile, we see that whereas aggressiveness is elevated, disconstraint is not. So the next scale that we would interpret from the behavioral dysfunction domain is the aggressiveness scale. We would not interpret disconstraint, of course, because it's below our clinical elevation cutoff of 65T. So just to review, we began by interpreting behavioral externalizing dysfunction because it was the highest elevated, in this case only elevated, higher order scale. Next, we moved into the interpretation of the RC scales in the behavioral dysfunction domain, RC4 and RC9. RC4 was not elevated, and RC9, as we saw, had a very prominent elevation of about 80T. Next, we moved into the interpretation of the specific problem scales, starting with the specific problem scales that are more narrow measures of RC9, which were aggression and activation. Both of those were elevated, so we would provide interpretations for those. And then we move to the final step here, aggressiveness and disconstraint, examining them within the behavioral dysfunction domain. We see that on this slide. Aggressiveness was elevated, so we would provide an interpretation for that scale, and disconstraint was not, so we would not provide an interpretation for disconstraint. Now, hypothetically, we would now want to go back and see if juvenile conduct problems and substance abuse, the more narrow measures associated with RC4, were elevated, and then interpret them. In this case, as we saw on the last slide, neither JCP or sub were elevated. So this would complete our interpretation of the MMPI-2-RF substantive scales in the behavioral dysfunction domain. So now we're at our first set of review questions for Unit 4. Which set of MMPI-2-RF scales needs to be examined first when interpreting scores on the substantive scales? A, higher order, B, RC, C, specific problems, or D, interests? The correct answer is A, the higher order scales. As we've discussed, the test is organized hierarchically with the higher order scales at the top of the hierarchy, and therefore interpretation of the substantive scales follows this same framework, beginning with the higher order scales and interpretation. And now we come to our second review question for this unit. Elevated scores on the specific problem scales, A, can be interpreted regardless of elevations on the higher order and RC scales. B, can be interpreted only if some of the higher order or RC scales are elevated. C, are less reliable if scores on the higher order or RC scales are not elevated. Or D, none of the above. The correct answer is A. Elevated scores on the specific problem scales can be interpreted regardless of whether or not there's elevations on the higher order and RC scales. So the bottom line here is that whenever a substantive scale is elevated, assuming that the protocol is valid, you interpret that substantive scale. The key thing to remember is the order in which you interpret the substantive scales. And again, we always begin with the higher order scales if there's an elevation, move on to the RC scales in our interpretation if there's an elevation, and then finish up with the specific problem scales and the Psi-5 scales, again, if they're elevated, of course. Let's move into a case example.
We're going to use the case of Mr. B to illustrate the process of MMPI-2-RF interpretation. Mr. B was, at the time that he was evaluated, a 47-year-old male who had recently lost his job. He also was experiencing some significant financial difficulties and marital problems. All of this led to his experiencing an expression of some suicidal thoughts, and that led to hospitalization. So he was assessed at intake to a psychiatric, inpatient psychiatric unit, and his MMPI-2-RF results will be used to illustrate the process of interpreting the MMPI-2-RF.
We're going to be reviewing the case of Mr. B. Mr. B is a 47-year-old man who's married but separated at the time of the evaluation. And he was admitted for inpatient psychiatric treatment, complaining of depression as well as suicidal thoughts. In terms of situational stressors, he had recently lost his job and he was also experiencing some marital difficulties. For those of you who are interested, the case of Mr. B is presented in its entirety in the MMPI-2-RF interpretive manual. That's that blue, relatively thin manual that you get with your MMPI-2-RF materials. So you can follow along with the case in the manual if you want, or refer to it later. I'd also suggest that if you have an MMPI-2-RF interpretive manual that you take it out now. It'll be very helpful as we go through this case. And also, if you have a copy of the MMPI-2-RF Interpretation Worksheet, that'll also be a good thing to refer to as we go through this case example of Mr. B. We'll begin our interpretation as we would begin any interpretation by first examining the MMPI-2-RF validity scale scores. And there are no causes for concern among these validity scales. All of them are within normal limits, so we are able to move ahead and interpret the MMPI-2-RF substantive scales. We see here Mr. B's higher order and restructured clinical scales as we now have moved into the substantive scale interpretation of this profile. Now, where do we begin our interpretation? We're going to begin with the highest elevated higher order scale. So we're going to start by interpreting emotional internalizing dysfunction, EID. We see here that it has a T-score of 80. And then what scale are we going to interpret next? Again, keeping in mind that we're going to do our entire interpretation of the emotional dysfunction domain now first. So the next scale that we would interpret is going to be RC2. In the emotional dysfunction domain, there are 3 RC scales: RCD, RC2, and RC7. Among those 3 scales, RC2 has the highest elevation, so we're going to begin next by interpreting RC2. After interpreting RC2, we're going to then interpret introversion, which is a measure that is associated with RC2 on the interpretation worksheet. And that will complete our interpretation of the RC2 branch within the emotional internalizing dysfunction domain. And so now we go back to the next highest elevated RC scale in this domain, which is going to be RCD. Once we provide an interpretation for RCD, we're then going to interpret the specific problem scales that are more narrow measures of RCD. This is going to include, for example, suicidal ideation, helplessness, self-doubt, and inefficacy. And we're going to interpret those 4 scales in order of elevation as well. As we see here, RC7, the last RC scale in the emotional dysfunction domain, is not elevated, so we are not going to interpret it. However, we will address and interpret any RC7 related specific problems and Sci-5 scales that are elevated on the next pages of the profiles. Once we've interpreted all of the scales that are elevated in the emotional dysfunction domain, then we would come back to this page and interpret any elevated higher order scales, which there are none, and next any other elevated RC scales from other domains. In this case, we see that the only interpretable RC scale other than RCD and RC2 is RC9. We see here a low score interpretation for RC9. That's, again, is going to be addressed and interpreted after we finish up with the emotional dysfunction domain. Here we have the beginning of the specific problem scales. We have the somatic cognitive specific problem scales and the internalizing specific problem scales. Staying with the theme of interpreting the emotional dysfunction domain scales, because EID was the highest, in this case only elevated higher order scale, we would interpret, after interpreting RCD, the suicidal ideation scales, helplessness, self-doubt, and inefficacy. And we're going to interpret those in order of elevation. So we would begin with SUI, move next to self-doubt, then inefficacy, and then round out those scales interpretation by providing interpretation of helplessness. We see also that stress-worry is elevated among the internalizing specific problem scales. Recall that this is a more narrow measure associated with RC7. RC7, of course, was not elevated, but after we provide interpretations for RC2 and introversion, RCD, and suicidal ideation, helplessness, self-doubt, and inefficacy, it would be at this point that we provide an interpretation for stress-worry. Again, stress-worry being one of the more narrow measures associated with RC7, which was not elevated. Finally, we do see that there are two scales, specific problem scales in the somatic cognitive dysfunction domain. After interpreting the emotional dysfunction domain scales, and after interpreting that low RC9 scale from the behavioral dysfunction domain, it would be at this point that we would provide an interpretation for the specific problem scales from the somatic cognitive dysfunction domain. And we would do this in order of elevation, but in this case, gastrointestinal complaints and cognitive complaints both have the same exact T-score. In the next page of the profile, we have the specific problem scales for the externalizing and interpersonal domains, and we also see here that we have the interest scales. Now, to review, at this point, we've already provided interpretations for the emotional dysfunction domain, because the high order scale EID was elevated, and we interpreted that domain first. And then we interpreted the behavioral dysfunction domain, because there was an RC scale from that domain with an elevation, RC9. It was a low score elevation, so the behavioral dysfunction domain was interpreted next. And then we interpreted the somatic cognitive dysfunction domain, specific problem scales that were elevated. And then now here we see that we next interpret the interpersonal functioning domains scales. And we have here among the interpersonal specific problem scales, elevations on interpersonal passivity and disaffiliativeness. We would begin our interpretation of scales in this domain by interpreting interpersonal passivity because it's the highest score, the highest elevation, and then we would provide an interpretation for disaffiliativeness. Finally, we do have a low score interpretation in the interest scale domain, where we have a low score on mechanical physical interests. So we would round out our interpretation of the substantive scales by providing an interpretation of that low score on mechanical physical interests. And we end our interpretation of this profile scores with the Psi-5 scales. We see two high score elevations on negative emotionality as well as introversion. Both of these scales will have been interpreted in the context of the emotional dysfunction domain. Next, we see a low score interpretation for aggressiveness. This scale would have been interpreted along with the low score on RC9 because both of those scales are in the behavioral dysfunction domain. And then finally, we see a low score elevation on psychoticism. This is the first interpretation we've had for a scale from the thought dysfunction domain. So this low score elevation will be interpreted on its own in a thought dysfunction domain interpretation. The next page of the score report is the MMPI-2-RF T-scores by domain sheet. This is actually a very useful summary of the MMPI-2-RF information because it actually organizes all of the scale scores into the standard interpretation framework where, for example, we begin with protocol validity in the areas of content non-responsiveness, over-reporting and under-reporting, and then move into interpreting the substantive scales by domain in the order of beginning with the higher order scales, moving on to the RC scales, and then finishing up with the specific problem scales and the Psi-5 scales. The sheet is also helpful because it facilitates use of the interpretation worksheet because it reports all of the scores in the same order as the interpretation worksheet, as we'll see on the next slide. This is also a good opportunity to review very quickly one final time how interpretation of the substantive scales would proceed. So we see under the substantive scale header, we have, of course, the major domains of substantive scale interpretation. So if we look at the emotional dysfunction domain, recall that we begin our interpretation with the highest elevated higher order scale, which in this case was EID at a T-score of 80. After we interpret EID, we stay in that domain and interpret next the highest elevated RC scale within that domain. So in this example would be RC2. Next, we'd interpret any specific problem scales or Psi-5 scales that are associated with RC2. In this case, it would be introversion, would be interpreted next. At this point, for the emotional dysfunction domain interpretation, we would go back to the RC scale level of measurement, and we see that the next highest elevated RC scale is RCD at a score of 77, so we would provide an interpretation of RCD next. After we interpret RCD, then we interpret its lower level scales in order of elevation, so we would interpret in this order suicidal ideation, self-doubt, inefficacy, and then helplessness. Then we go back to the RC scales within this domain. We see that RC7 is not elevated, so we do not provide an interpretation of it. But we do still want to examine the rest of the scales in the emotional dysfunction domain to see if there are elevations at the specific problem scale or Psi-5 scale level that have not already been reported. And we see here that stress worry is elevated, as well as negative emotionality, neuroticism. So we would provide at the end of our emotional dysfunction interpretation of these two scales. At this point, let's work through how we would use the MMPI-2-RF Interpretation Worksheet to help us to interpret Mr. B's MMPI-2-RF scores. And what you see here is that all of the scores have been transferred over to the sheet in the appropriate areas here for the validity scales, and then we have our interpretations based on the scale scores. And in the case of the validity scales, as we saw earlier, there was no cause for concern. There were no elevations on the validity scales. So we have very simple interpretations of there are no indications of non-responsiveness, there are no indications of over-reporting, and there are no indications of under-reporting. So we have more to say when we move into the substantive scale interpretation. The first domain listed in this area is somatic cognitive dysfunction. You recall earlier that we had elevations present on gastrointestinal complaints and cognitive complaints, and so we're going to provide our interpretations of those two areas here. Now, one thing to note is that if we did have an elevation on RC1, which we don't, but if we did, we would interpret that RC1 score first before moving into the somatic cognitive specific problem scales that are elevated. But in any case, we have here that the test taker reports a large number of gastrointestinal complaints and likely has a history of gastrointestinal problems and is preoccupied with health concerns. He reports also a diffuse pattern of cognitive difficulties, including memory problems, difficulties concentrating, etc. So we have here our interpretations for gastrointestinal complaints and cognitive complaints, both of which were elevated above 65T. The next domain on the worksheet is the emotional dysfunction domain. And again, we're going to start our interpretation of this domain with the higher order scale, in this case, emotional internalizing dysfunction domain, which is elevated with a T-score of 80. His responses indicate considerable emotional distress that is likely to be perceived as a crisis. Now, the next scale that we're going to interpret is going to be the highest elevated RC scale, which is RC2. He reports a lack of positive emotional experiences, significant anhedonia, and a lack of interest. We're next going to interpret introversion, which is a more narrow measure associated with RC2. He is very likely to be pessimistic, to be socially introverted and disengaged, to lack energy, and to display vegetative depression. Now that we've interpreted RC2 and introversion, we're next going to interpret the second highest elevated RC scale in this domain, which is RCD, a T-score of 77. He reports being sad and unhappy and being dissatisfied with his current life circumstances. Now that we've interpreted RCD, we're going to interpret the specific problem scales that are more narrow measures of RCD. So this is going to be suicidal ideation, helplessness, hopelessness, self-doubt, and inefficacy. He reports a history of suicidal ideation and/or attempts and is likely to be preoccupied with suicide or death, is at risk for suicide attempt, and may have recently attempted suicide. He reports feeling hopeless and pessimistic and likely feels overwhelmed and that life is a strain, believes he cannot be helped, believes he gets a raw deal from life, and lacks motivation for change. Reports lacking confidence, likely feels inferior and insecure, is self-disparaging, is prone to rumination, is interpunitive, and presents with lack of confidence and feelings of uselessness. He reports being passive, indecisive, and inefficacious, and believes he is incapable of coping with his current life difficulties. So that would complete our interpretation of the specific problem scales that are associated with RCD. And as an aside, we're getting here perhaps a very coherent picture that we would likely expect from somebody who presented for suicidal ideation to a psychiatric inpatient hospital like we have here. All right, then finally, the next step in the emotional dysfunction domain would be to look at RC7. RC7 is not elevated, and so now we look at the remaining scales from this domain at the specific problem scale and the Psi-5 scale level and see if any of those are elevated. Again, stress, worry, and negative emotionality are the only ones that are elevated, so we're going to end the interpretation of the emotional dysfunction domain by reporting those scores. He reports an above average level of stress and worry and is likely to be stress reactive and worry prone and to engage in obsessive rumination. So we've have both interpretations of RC7 and negative emotionality there in that last sentence. On the next page of the interpretation worksheet, we begin by interpreting the thought dysfunction domain. And in this domain, we begin with the higher order scale, thought dysfunction, which is within normal limits. We would next move into the RC scales in this domain, RC6 and RC8, Both of those are also within normal limits. So we would next move into interpretation of psychoticism, the Psy-5 scale. This is a low score interpretation for psychoticism. And the interpretive statement for this score of 38 in psychoticism is that there are no indications of thought dysfunction, which is in this case a relevant finding as this individual is presenting for treatment at a psychiatric inpatient hospital. In the next paragraph, we have the behavioral dysfunction domain scales. We begin by interpreting BXD. That score is within normal limits. We move next to the RC scales in this domain, RC4 and RC9. RC4 is within normal limits. RC9 is less than 39, and so there's a low score elevation here. So we interpret this low score on RC9 by writing that he reports a below average level of activation and engagement with his environment and is likely to have a very low energy level and be disengaged from his environment. Next, after we interpret RC9, we interpret the specific problem scales that are associated with RC9. This is going to be aggression and activation. I think I actually may have missed this earlier as we were going through the profile, but we do have a low score elevation on aggression with a score of 37. So he's reporting a below average level of physically aggressive behavior. This illustrates, by the way, why it's helpful to use this interpretation worksheet to make sure you get all of the information interpreted. Activation is within normal limits, so we then move on to the remaining scales from the behavioral dysfunction domain. Among the remaining scales, the only one that has an interpretable score is aggressiveness, which has a T-score here of 32. We would then provide the interpretation at the end here that he reports being interpersonally passive as well as submissive. In the next section, we have the interpersonal functioning domain, and we see here that there are elevations on interpersonal passivity, social avoidance, as well as disaffiliativeness. So we're going to provide interpretations for these three scales, beginning with interpersonal passivity. He reports being unassertive and submissive, not liking to be in charge, failing to stand up for himself, and being ready to give in to others. He is likely to be passive and submissive in his interpersonal relationships and to be over-controlled. He reports not enjoying social events and avoiding social situations. So we're moving into our interpretation of social avoidance here. He is likely to be introverted, having difficulty forming close relationships, and be emotionally restricted. And then we're going to end with our interpretation of disaffiliativeness. He reports disliking people and being around them and is likely to be asocial. So interestingly, one of the issues that this individual presented with was marital difficulties. And we can see here that certainly some of these marital difficulties may be a result of his passivity, social avoidance, as well as potentially his disaffiliativeness. And now we've come to the last page of the MMPI-2-RF Interpretation Worksheet. We begin with the interpretation of the interest scales. Among the interest scales, only mechanical physical interest is interpretable. That's a low score elevation here for MEC. And the interpretation is that he reports no interest in activities or occupations of a mechanical or physical nature. Next, we move into diagnostic considerations. Now, recall back that when we were going through the substantive scale interpretation tables, they were organized in such a way where we had interpretations for each scale based on the test responses, based on empirical correlates, and then most scales had also diagnostic considerations as well as treatment considerations. So in this diagnostic considerations section, this is where we summarize all of the diagnostic considerations associated with elevated MMPI-2-RF substantive scales across all of the domains of the test. So we see here, for example, if physical origin for gastrointestinal complaints has been ruled out, evaluate for somatoform disorder. We also have evaluate for internalizing disorders, major depression, cluster C personality disorder, disorders involving excessive stress and worry, such as obsessive compulsive disorder, and dependent personality disorder. So again, these diagnostic considerations were implicated by elevations on scales from any domain, any substantive domain of the MMPI-2-RF. Then finally, we have treatment considerations. And here too, we have a summary of all the possible treatment considerations based on elevated MMPI-2-RF scores from any substantive domain. So we have, for example, stress reduction for gastrointestinal complaints, origins of cognitive complaints should be explored, emotional difficulties may motivate him for treatment, evaluate for antidepressant medication, may require inpatient treatment for significant depression. Given his circumstances, that's probably a very appropriate treatment consideration. Low positive emotions may interfere with treatment, anhedonia is a target for treatment, and risk for suicide should be assessed immediately in caps there, again because of that very high elevation suicidal death ideation. Loss of hope and feelings of despair as early targets for intervention. Indecisiveness may interfere with establishing treatment goals as well as progress in treatment. Stress management and excessive worry and rumination as targets for intervention. Reducing passive submissive behavior as a target for intervention. His aversive response to relationships may make it difficult to form a therapeutic alliance, and lack of outside interests as a target for intervention. So we've reached the end of this module on MMPI-2-RF interpretation. I'm just going to leave you with a couple of prompts for reflection. So reflect on the interpretation process that we used with this case just now. How do you think that the structured process helped in understanding Mr. B's treatment needs? And then also I'd invite you to think about how you might apply this sort of structured process to one of your current cases, perhaps someone who you're thinking about giving the MMPI-2-RF to, or maybe an individual in the past who you didn't have the opportunity to give the test to. And I'll just conclude by saying that, once again, my name is Anthony Terrascavage, and please feel free to look me up online and contact me, email me with any questions you might have. I'm more than happy to help and answer any of those questions. Thank you.